that rapidly got worse. In addition to the threat of bandits, which had not, in 4 days of travel, so far manifested itself, there was the more clearly present threat of the inns themselves, ancient, filthy structures of adobe brick, primitive beyond belief, and inhabited by nests of scorpions and centipedes, as well as the more usual fauna of chickens, pigs, and village dogs. There was the food, mostly greasy tamales, inadequately cooked beans, and the national staple of tortillas, unleavened corn cakes cooked on an open grill. Born in the slave quarters of a cane plantation upriver from New Orleans, January had eaten worse, but not recently. Most deadly of all, there was the Yankee coachman's driving, as he lashed his team of 4 skittery little Mustangs at crazy speed over the high yellow passes of the Sierra Madre Orientale, causing the diligencia to sway and jolt, and causing January to wonder if he shouldn't have damned his friend Hannibal to whatever penalty the government of New Spain, pardon me, he corrected himself, Mexico, thought fit to dole out, and stayed at home to enjoy the wonderful state of having actually, finally, against all odds, married Rose Vitrac. A particularly savage rut hurled the coach nearly sideways and precipitated his new bride nearly into his lap. Covered with yellow dust, sweating in the crystalline heat of these parched gray peaks, her soft, snuff-colored curls skinned back tight into unflattering braids for travel, it took everything in him not to seize her in his arms and cover her with kisses. That would really give Mr. Dillard something to complain about, he thought, and it would shock the other passengers, 2 German merchants, their doddering Swiss valet, and a young priest, speechless. Instead, he remarked, "At least at this rate we'll get there soon and learn what actually happened." He gestured with Hannibal's letter and tucked it back into his pocket. Rose removed her spectacles, sought vainly for some portion of her clothing not thick with dust in order to clean the dusty lenses, then sighed and resignedly replaced them on her nose. "You don't think Hannibal actually did it, do you?" This was a question they'd asked each other for 3 weeks now, when not occupied with the logistics of honeymoon copulation in a stateroom bunk barely the size of a particularly stingy coffin. The Belle Marquise, out of New Orleans to Veracruz, transported pineapples, tobacco, and the insect life that invariably accompanied them, and the floor was not an option. Mostly they wondered if their friend, of average height and skeletally thin from the ravages of consumption, could have physically accomplished murder. And the answer, of course, was yes. Even were young Fernando as tall as January, and, like January, built upon what English novelists like to call Herculean lines, there was always poison, there were firearms, there was the possibility of a stiletto in the back in a darkened room. January and Rose had whiled away many hours evolving such hypothetical scenarios. What if Fernando habitually wore a steel breastplate to bed? One can mix sulfate of mercury with candle wax and make a poisoned candle that, when burned, will kill the person in the room. As they strolled the decks of the Belle Marquise, waiting for a northern wind to fill the sails for those last few maddening miles into Veracruz, and latterly, as they'd had the marrow pounded out of their bones by the frantic pace of the diligencia over rutted mountain roads. In the absence of the slightest information about the victim, the circumstances, or any conceivable motivation for the murder, it was as good a way as any to pass the time. But that wasn't what Rose meant now, and January knew it. His mind returned to the reeking heat and darkness of the waterfront at New Orleans, the tail end of summer 1832. Even at that hour of the night, and he'd heard the cathedral clock strike 3 as he'd left the garçonniere above his mother's kitchen, there was activity along the levee. Stevedores unloading bales from the big, ugly, flat-sided steamboats. Filthy ruffians in coarse calico shirts and heavy Conestoga boots driving pigs from the flatboats by the light of torches. Whores in tawdry dresses plying their trade in the shadows. Music jingled from the saloons along Rue de la Veille, where men gambled through the night. Somewhere a slave gang hauling wood onto a boat wailed a primitive holler. Roaches the size of mice crept on the sides of the warehouses, or flew with roaring wings around the flaming cressets. The warm air breathed and blew with the storm that flickered far out over the Gulf.